the West has orders of magnitude more military capability than Russia has. Simply putting a no-fly zone in place over Ukraine would have minimum risk for the West in terms of bodies, but would create a real nightmare for Russia.
If Trump did decide, you know what, I'm fed up of this, you've been stringing me along, I want a peace deal, Putin's not serious, we need to ramp up the pressure, what are those sticks that America could play?
Well, in short, as we've discussed at the start, Europe has done enough to stop Ukraine losing, but not enough to help it win. The West has orders of magnitude more military capability than Russia has. Simply putting a no-fly zone in place over Ukraine would have minimum risk for the West in terms of bodies, but would create a real nightmare for Russia, and therefore would have to rethink its objectives. And the danger of that is the legacy would be that Russia was stopped. Now, Russia will almost certainly want to end this war on its own terms, in other words, and display it as a victory, not as a young child that's been brought into check by Big Brother or their parents. And I think that's the bit that President Trump could use. I'm not sure whether President Trump has the appetite for that, but I do think European leaders, we saw the military chiefs meeting last week, they were ostensibly looking at the sort of post-war, how do you create a security environment? But there is no doubt in my mind, certainly some of the feedback is that they were also invited to look at what options are available to Europe in order to bolster the security of Ukraine. Because bluntly, if America sort of walks away, which it looks like it is doing metaphorically at the moment, then that weakens Ukraine. A weakened Ukraine makes a more vulnerable Europe. And the question is for Europe then, do we wait until Russia gets to our door, or do we actually take on Russia when it's at its weakest, which is about now? It's been hurting, it's lost a lot of kit and equipment, and it's probably close to the point where it needs to stop anyway. So I think there's some fascinating ways in which the military can be brought to bear, and there will be lots of options put on the table by our military leaders. The question is whether our politicians have the appetite for the risk involved.
That's such a good point, because obviously there are these discussions ongoing about Keir Starmer's idea of a coalition of the willing enforcing a peace in Ukraine after any peace deal. But that could be way off. I mean, we don't know when a peace deal may or may not be agreed. And I wonder if more needs to be done by Ukraine's European allies right now to double down on their support for Kyiv. And I wonder whether, for example, that involves the Germans providing tourist missiles, whether that involves the British and the French loosening restrictions yet further on where British and French supplied long-range missiles can strike inside Russia, maybe other stuff as well. What are your thoughts on that, Sean?
Yes, I think there will be a lot of options. One of the tricky bits here, James, is that at the start of the war, there was a lot of talk by the European countries that we would need to ramp up our defence industry so that we could produce enough missiles, bombs, rockets, weapons of war, which bluntly, most of them, like Storm Shadow, you talked about, that was built 30 years ago. The production line stopped. So you need to invest in industry to get those production lines up and running. And although the West said that they were going to do that, literally as months turned to years, there was still no evidence they'd done that, because Europe is, holding a big overdraft. They weren't going to invest in industry and then watch the war end and go, oh, well, we've wasted our money. But actually now the double whammy is, of course, that not only when I was in the military, we never had enough weapons to do what we were asked to do, to then actually give some of the weapons we do have to Ukraine, further diminished our war stocks. And now the double whammy is that Russia looks like it is going to prevail in Ukraine. That enhances their risk to Europe. Also, the security umbrella which we relied on from America looks a little bit more vulnerable. So all of a sudden, the big challenge for the West is going, do we prioritize our own defense and refill our stockpiles and actually just hope that Ukraine can hold out? Or do we focus all our effort into Ukraine and leave ourselves more vulnerable? There's some really profound questions as to where the priority should lie. And I think at the moment, even countries like Poland, who are investing a huge amount now, nearly 5% of GDP in defense, are they going to put soldiers forward into Ukraine to help them? No, because bluntly, history shows that Poland is vulnerable. They will be making sure that their nation is protected. So it's really interesting to see, you've got Italy, they're not going to be involved in any sort of military action, neither is Spain. The big powerhouses, as you say, are Germany, France, and the United Kingdom. But we can't do it alone. But I do think the no-fly zone is the most overt way engaging with Russia. It minimises the risk. We don't want to put boots on the ground at this stage. That would be, I did 3 tours, 2 years of my life in Afghanistan, and watched 454 of our soldiers never return home, and that left a profound scar on our country. That those numbers would pale into insignificance if we were to start putting significant forces on the ground into Ukraine. There are other ways in which we could help, and I think air power is one of the key areas of focus.
And do you think we should be looking at doing a no-fly zone right now?
There's an initiative called Sky Shield. I don't know if you've seen it doing the rounds. It's an initiative that looks at how Europe could galvanise around some form of no-fly zone. And it's gaining quite a lot of momentum. The point is, though, it remains a how. It doesn't answer the what and the why questions. What should Europe do and why? And by that I mean there are lots of military options available on the table, but bluntly, it's a question of whether the politicians have the appetite. There are still people who are fearful of taking on a nuclear power like Russia. They think it's an escalation. And actually, one of the challenges, I know it's only language, but one of the frustrations from a military perspective is you go, now hang on a minute, Russia invaded Ukraine. All we should be doing is matching him. When he uses long-range missiles, we're going to match that with long-range missiles. He brought North Korean troops. Why don't we therefore match it? Why are we so nervous about talking about it in the form of escalation? Because that plays to President Putin's agenda. All we should be doing is just matching. The world cannot tolerate people using force to take over other countries. Where will it stop if Russia gets away with it? And that's the problem at the moment, is we need to create enough of a robust political intent behind this, because militarily there's lots of options available. We just have to have the chutzpah to use them.
And I suppose now there's the added complication of not just will it lead to escalation with Russia, but how will the Americans react? Donald Trump may not take too kindly to the Europeans imposing a no-fly zone in Ukraine when he's trying to negotiate a ceasefire deal. And who knows, maybe they then stop intelligence sharing once again. Maybe they pause their military aid. Maybe Elon Musk says, well, I'm going to turn off your access to Starlink.
Yeah, I mean, you've touched a sort of a very raw point, I think, which is America's strategy seems to be make sure Ukraine is weak and therefore you can control it in the negotiations. Because bluntly, the war is between Russia and Ukraine. What role does America have in any form of negotiation? What it's doing is it's using its power to coerce President Zelensky to be at the table. But it looks very unlikely that's going to work with President Putin. And therefore, you've got this situation where America does not want to embolden and strengthen Ukraine because that's a threat to Russia, therefore undermines the talks. But Europe is looking at its own national security and doesn't trust President Putin. I think the other issue here is that, Ukraine is 3,000 miles away from America. They've said it's not their focus. Their focus is China. And therefore, just do a peace, stop fighting, put a bow around it. Right, we've done, President Trump can announce success. But that's completely missing this point that actually, if you don't provide that long-range security, all you've actually done is put a sticky plaster over the problem. And it will come back to bite you. Europe knows that. President Trump knows that his age, he's not going to do another term as president. It's not going to come back to bite him. He's brought peace to Europe. Whereas actually it's not. It's not actually solved the problem. And in many ways, it's emboldened President Putin. So you've got this dichotomy that Europe recognizes that long-term security is vital for Ukraine. It doesn't appear that's a priority for America at all.
And of course, the key question, Sean, is how do you ensure that long-term security? I mentioned the idea of a coalition of the willing earlier. Steve Witkoff in that interview with Tucker Carlson appeared to dismiss that notion. But do you think it is a viable option?
It is, but I think you've got to factor time into this as well. Some of the conversations, somebody in the media has talked about how do you immediately tomorrow, put a force into Ukraine that will stop Russia. I think it's slightly more subtle than that, because Russia has lost a huge amount of materiel, tanks, fighter jets, people. It is probably close to grinding to a halt. Most people believe that Russia's pushing forward in the Donbass because that's its objectives. Luhansk, Donetsk, Zaporizhia and Kherson and Crimea. That's the land bridge down. And once they've achieved all of that, and that's why the focus at the moment on Pokrovsk in the region, once they've achieved that, they'll probably pause for breath. So it does appear that Russia is near the end of its tether. It doesn't want to do another round of mobilizations. It can't generate tanks and equipment fast enough at the moment to replace the losses. Why do I say that? It means that for the next 5 years, Russia probably doesn't pose a significant threat to Europe. So in terms of Europe, we don't have to put the most robust military presence into Ukraine. What we've got to do is get our defense industries onto a war footing so that we can refill the stockpiles, get our ammunition sorted out, replenish Ukraine, whilst also putting a framework of military capability in place, and then focus the next 5 years, when we've got this breather, on getting Ukraine's indigenous military capability as robust as it can. We've given them F-16s, but bluntly, they're shooting their own F-16s down because they don't have the training, they don't have the infrastructure, they don't have the doctrine, they're not used to operating this Western kit. Give us 5 years to actually get Ukraine a couple of steps up the ladder of developing their own national capability. Then, with every day that goes by, Ukraine gets stronger. The West has got more weapons in its stockpile. The West is more able to offer credible defense. And Russia, therefore, it creates doubt in Russia's mind about would the benefits outweigh the risks. So it's not just about day one.
And do you think that's about it providing an effective deterrent against future aggression from Putin? Or do you think, sadly, he will be back and it's about being ready for when he is?
Well, that's something you've got to get inside Putin's mind, isn't it? And I return to the thesis that most Ukrainians, and I think most military analysts, believe that, Putin sees no future with an autonomous, self-governing Ukraine. And, day one of the war back in February of 22, remember that 40-kilometer convoy and going towards Kyiv and Hostomel airfield, and then reports that the troops were carrying their dress uniforms with them because they just expected to walk into Kyiv, and actually the West thought that probably Ukraine would struggle to withstand the blow. Amazingly, Ukraine did an amazing job, and gradually over the years, the West has gradually stepped up support. But Russia will have learned a lot of lessons from this. At the moment, its economy is on a war footing. It is generating weapons, tanks, military equipment, a pace. And it's also learned lessons from its activities. It knows that Ukraine is using drones very effectively. So now it's putting various protections on its tanks to try and make those less capable. Their soldiers are battle hardened. So I do think it's going to be an interesting conundrum. Ultimately, Russia won't go any further if it realizes that the cost of it far outweighs the benefit. The trouble is Putin was hurt with the fall of the Soviet Union, and he's clearly trying to rebuild it. The next thing we're going to see, James, confidently predict, is that when there is a ceasefire, then you're going to have Belarus fall. And at the moment, because Belarus is nothing more than a Russian state, but loosely held by Lukashenko, that most of the people probably believe they're not in a Russian state, but that will be a lot easier for Putin just to take over. And once again, we're seeing another part of the former Soviet Union re-established.
Sean, we always appreciate your time. Thank you so much for joining us again on Frontline.
It's a pleasure, James. All the very best.
Thank you for watching today's episode of Frontline. For early access to our videos, member-only Q&As and live streams, then sign up for a membership via the link in the description. And for the latest news and breaking stories, listen to Times Radio and follow us at thetimes.com.